Hi, it's Ed D'Agostino. Welcome to another edition of Global Macro Update. Last week, I had the privilege of attending Camp Kotok, which is sponsored by David Kotok and Cumberland Advisors in Sarasota, Florida. And the big topic among economists and investors was inflation. And one of the forces that we talked about as being particularly inflationary and long-term inflationary is the relationship between the US and China and the need for the US to decouple from China. There was another group comprised mainly of geopolitical experts who said, yes, you economists are right, that would be inflationary and it will be when it happens, but it is not happening yet at any scale. And the reason it's not happening is because there are no good alternatives for moving that manufacturing capacity out of China and to somewhere closer. I'm going to discuss this topic as well as the US relationship with China overall and what's happening in Taiwan with Emily de la Bruyere. She is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and she is a two-time Strategic Investment Conference panelist. Always enjoy speaking with her. Stay tuned for my discussion with Emily de la Bruyere. Emily, great to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to this conversation. For those of you, or for those of us who don't know your background, I've been lucky enough to speak with you for two strategic investment conferences now. But for those viewers who aren't familiar with your work, can you just give us a quick summary of your views on China and on their global strategy and industrial strategy?
Of course, and thank you for having me. Basically, what I do all day is I stare at Chinese industrial policy and technological policy and the strategy undergirding that, and also what the consequences are for China's role in the international ecosystem, as well as the US-China and international China competition. And I mean, the very bottom line of, I guess, how I frame this overall question is that whether the US likes it or not, we're currently engaged in a great power competition with Beijing. It's a different kind of great power competition than what the US or the world has seen in the past because it's playing out in large part in the private sector, in the commercial domain, in the industrial domain. And that's a function of how China competes. It's also a function of today's globalized environment. And like what this means, the fact that we're in this competition right now, is that there is a fundamental tension between how China is trying to position itself in the international order and how the US is positioning itself. And that tension isn't going to go away. And that there's going to be this waxing and waning of the Beijing-Washington relationship the way there has been over the past decade. But fundamentally, the trend is downwards and it's going to stay downwards.
What would you say is China's ultimate goal in this struggle? Are they just striving to make sure they have dominance in Asia, or does this go well beyond that?
This goes well beyond that. Beijing's ambitions, they're international, it's global. And the idea, I mean, the word I often find myself repeating over and over, because I do a lot of repeating over and over, is it's control. Beijing is trying to establish global control, not just global leadership. And Beijing is trying to do that in a way that starts with resources and therefore with the private sector, because as China sees it, which I think is a logic that makes sense, fundamentally national power or any power at all is a function of resources and control over them.
The relationship between the US and China seems particularly stressed right now after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and now subsequent congressional visits announced. How does Taiwan fit into this puzzle that you're talking about?
Taiwan is, I mean, it's endlessly fascinating. It's a total dilemma in terms of its positioning. And I think one that's actually misunderstood or at least understood in mainstream analysis or discussion on the subject. In the very surface level is that, needless to say, Beijing thinks that Taiwan is part of China. And the US has historically maintained a kind of ambiguous posture, but that supports Taiwan being the flourishing independent democracy that it is. And as Beijing gets more aggressive, it also gets more aggressive vis-a-vis Taiwan and its ultimate reunification goals. As the US-China competition at the same time gets harsher, Taiwan becomes more and more of a sensitivity that the US has not only the opportunity, but also in many ways the obligation to press on because China is emboldened. But there are all these other parts of the Taiwan question that are really critical for the different factors at play in different elements of the competition. Like Taiwan is a absolutely linchpin factor in the international semiconductor value chain. And also Taiwan is economically absolutely dependent on China. And the private sector in Taiwan tends also to have business dealings in China and recognizes the dependence on China. And we often just think about what if there's a war in Taiwan? We don't think about all the different economic levers that China can pull and all of their consequences and what those mean for the international supply chain, which, I mean, we could talk about forever.
Emily, you co-wrote a piece for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where you're a senior fellow. And this piece really illuminated for me the challenges that we face in the West dealing with China and specifically with national security interests. I'm wondering if we could look into that article a little bit, if you could explain a little bit for us, because the issue that you got to in that article is that the US can implement all these policies to protect national strategic interests, but if Europe is doing the exact opposite, then what's the point? Can you talk a little bit more about just the need for the US and Europe to get on the same page and what that would take?
That's precisely the argument. And it's actually fun because I think it overlaps directly with that Taiwan question too, right? Because you could write the same piece about TSMC or any other Taiwanese giant in a critical supply chain. But what we looked at in that piece, we used as our case study or our hook, Airbus, Europe's aerospace giant, and Airbus's exposure to and interaction with the Chinese government, military, and more broadly scientific and technological ecosystems. And what you find when you look at that is that Airbus is banking on the Chinese market for its commercial prospects, and it has effectively traded in exchange for that market its cooperation with China's scientific and technological, but also military modernization project. Airbus has innovation centers in China. It depends on Chinese manufacturers for critical inputs into its supply chain. It works on everything from satellite technology to aerospace intelligentization, as Chinese sources put it, research and development with Chinese player, and it partners particularly closely with AVIC, which is one of China's major state-owned defense conglomerates. And by partners closely, I mean their investment ties, their joint ventures, direct investment as well. And this isn't, so like we took Airbus as the case, but it's not really just an Airbus question. Like this is something you see across the board within the private sector and especially the international private sector. And it's something that the US has imposed all of these new regulatory controls on our American private sector to try to prevent, with the recognition that doing this gives Beijing access to advanced technologies and also China leverage over critical industries, including the defense industry. But as you said, the point we come to is that all of these restrictions that the US has placed on domestic industry, they might apply to Boeing, but they don't apply to Airbus. And in our environment, the US needs its allies and partners to form the kind of skilled coalition necessary to compete with China, but also as long as Beijing can access Europe, it can access the US, and it can access US value chains and US technologies. And that means that not only is our offense or proactive approach impossible without Europe also being on the same page, but our defense is impossible as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about how hard it would be to decouple from China for the US or for a European company. I think you said Airbus has 23% of its annual revenue coming from China. I mean, that is a massive, massive amount of revenue for a huge European company, a really important European company. There's other companies, there are countless numbers that we can. Tesla is another one with a big presence in China. We could go on and on and on. But the fact is, it would be potentially catastrophic financially at the individual company level to decouple, at least to decouple quickly. How should the European and US governments deal with that?
That's a great question. And it's the multi-trillion, whatever the number after trillion is, question. There are kind of two big things that have to change for decoupling or any version of decoupling, whatever we're going to call it, to happen. One of those orients around supply inputs, supply chains, value chains. There has been a massive, massive loss of industry in the West over the past decades, and that industry has gone to China. And the fundamental bottom line is that among US and trusted economies, we can't make what we need. And we need China to make what we need. And when I say what we need, it's, for us to have this conversation via a computer or for our militaries to operate. So there's just this fundamental physical impossibility of actually decoupling in the immediate, because there has to be that investment in industry. The second thing that has to happen is more abstract, and that's more like the frameworks that guide businesses and the business models that are being employed. As you said, Airbus depends for something like 23% on the Chinese market. That's not a unique number. And companies and investors have based their entire frameworks for the future and their growth models on the idea that they're going to capture the Chinese market or capture a foothold in the Chinese market. And that promises effectively infinite growth. Airbus could still be a successful company without the Chinese market. Ultimately, Airbus will lose the Chinese market. I'll get to that in a second. And so what has to happen is an adjustment of the frameworks to acknowledge the reality that there is no free lunch. And as you said, that's going to hurt, right? Because this promise of infinite growth ultimately isn't going to come to fruition. And companies are going to have to tighten their belts, and they're going to have to be more realistic about their expectations of the market. But as I alluded to, it's going to happen eventually, because Beijing isn't going to let Airbus hold the Chinese market. It's not going to let Tesla hold the Chinese market. What it's doing is it's taking advantage of them in the short term so that it can curate domestic champions and ultimately give them monopolies over the Chinese market, and also lead them to compete with Tesla and Airbus internationally. Which is to say that this reckoning will happen one way or the other. So it's really in companies' interests to start positioning for it now.
And my assumption would be that if this move doesn't start to happen soon and be initiated by us, the West, it will happen down the road when it's convenient for China, initiated by China, and at the absolutely most inopportune moment for the West.
Exactly. And when the West has lost all leverage over China.
And that's why, that's really the underpinning. That kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation. That's the why. Why do we have to pull away from being dependent on China? It's because of what you just said.
Exactly. There are normative elements here. There are nationalistic elements here if you want to get into them. But fundamentally, it's the bottom line. And it's the bottom line, not in some really distant future, but in one that's coming up on us, I think, more quickly than we imagine.
So are we starting to make the right moves, Emily, in this country at least, with policies such as the CHIPS Act?
We're starting really with baby steps. I think the CHIPS Act is championed as a huge breakthrough. And by Washington standards, it's absolutely a huge breakthrough. But it's also wildly inadequate for the competition at hand. And it's inadequate on a couple different levels. First of all, because it's giving money to companies that remain exposed to the Chinese market for the same Airbus, Tesla reasons that we've just talked about, which means that a lot of this capital and the research and development that's going to come out of it risks supporting China's efforts, even if this is supposed to be competitive ambition. It's also inadequate because the focus, even as it's framed as an industrial policy that's about bringing back American industry, the focus is disproportionately in the actual funding on advanced technologies and research and development, rather than the upstream inputs in the value chain on which all of that rests. So it could, if it doesn't get operationalized or that doesn't get fixed right, end up continuing to build on a foundation that's dependent on China. But the other reason it's inadequate is this is just semiconductors. And semiconductors are important, but they're a tiny fraction in the overall industrial competition underway. And this bill took 2 years of like perfect alignment in the political stars. And what that in particular really shows is that the US getting serious about the industrial competition, it can be signaled by Washington that Washington will support it, but the ultimate action is going to have to come from the private sector.
Can you give us a couple of pictures on how this could play out if we don't decouple adequately? What happens? And then if we do, if we get everything right, what does the world look like? Are there basically two big trading blocks instead of one? What? Tell me, give me some hope.
Well, then let's start off with the really pessimistic picture first.
Okay.
If we don't get it right, the short of it is America loses. We continue to chip away at any industrial capacity. Without industrial capacity, we stop being a center of gravity. We don't have any economic resilience, which is a reality that's, I think, become very clear from the economic turmoil of the past year in particular, that there kind of isn't that like buffer insulation within our system. And therefore, there isn't the opportunity for growth. So we stagnate. It's classic fall of empire. Beijing holds the strings, and therefore, because American leadership, growth, prosperity stems from originally a really strong industrial base, and then built on top of it, control over the systems and the networks of our international world order. Those systems and networks are currently being reshaped because we're in an industrial revolution. So in a scenario where we don't get anything right, the new systems and networks are China controlled, because Beijing also dominates production and therefore controls the global order. So it's the one that all industry depends on, and therefore that has the greatest future growth-wise. It's also the one that is deciding how e-commerce, digital payments, next generation telecommunications, next generation space systems work, and therefore that's shaping like the higher value add of our system. And the US falls apart, and we probably become a Europe, but that's probably best case scenario, because unlike Europe versus the US, we're not friends with China in the same way, and Beijing wants to beat us. So worse off, we probably become more of what Russia has been to us over the past period.
So does Europe maintain a better relationship with China in that scenario?
Probably.
Because they're already less of a threat, essentially?
Yes.
Okay.
So there's not the same vendetta. And a lot is still up to Europe. Like Europe hasn't fully picked a side, which is not good for Europe, and is also not good for the US. There's also, of course, a better scenario, and that's one where the US actually starts to leverage its existing strengths, invest in domestic industry, where markets wake up to the reality that deglobalization type advantages are actually competitive advantages for companies. Investors start calling on companies to reduce their exposure to China because they recognize that's in the long-term interest of their investments. The government creates the incentives for this to happen, and the US is able to get into gear for the current industrial revolution.
So
does that mean there are two blocks? It might. And it's tough because in a globalized world, like there's one internet. But there's also this fundamental tension between the US and China that isn't going to go away.
That was one of the topics that we discussed at Camp Kotok, was how if we get this right, and if we bring all this production back to the US, even with automation, there's going to be a need for more people. And I live in Connecticut. 25 years ago, if you drove through the rural Connecticut, you would see small machine shops, small metalworking shops everywhere, and they were all supported by the aerospace industry that's here. Those are all gone, long gone now, and there's strip malls in their place. We're sitting in the US right now that has unemployment rate that at a 40-year low. Labor participation rates are incredibly low. How do we, from a practical perspective, bring even more production here? I don't see that happening without it being incredibly inflationary. So there's short-term pain associated with this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
The brutal part is yes, there's enormous short-term pain associated with all of this. And really, in the ideal scenario, you're trading off short-term pain for long-term, much, much greater pain. And it is inflationary to some extent. But this is like the necessary move to prevent us from just entering into an inflation cycle or an inflation recession cycle and just absolutely having our economic fundamentals get trashed. The other B is that this isn't something the US is going to be able to fix alone. And yes, some industries should absolutely be brought back to the US. And that's going to exacerbate a labor crunch. We also do need new technologies to address that. But US allies and partners are going to be really critical for this. And that means Mexico and Canada. It means Europe. It means Asian partners. And those include places where there is lower cost and more abundant labor. But there has to be, all of this has to be done according to a strategic prioritization framework that says, here are things that need to be at home because they're sensitive and they matter for our future growth. Here are things that we can't afford to make at home or we don't have the resources for, and that's for allies and partners. And then here are things where, the market actually can rule in the way that we've traditionally thought of the market ruling.
Emily, where can viewers go to get more of your ideas and thoughts?
Thank you for asking. The new platform, relatively new platform that I've launched for a lot of this commentary is called Force Distance Times. It's available at forcedistancetimes.com. And we're a solutions-focused magazine dedicated to new ideas, frameworks, and commentary on today's industrial competition. The goal is to bring voices from all the different fields that are relevant to this question and have them contribute commentary that isn't in the drinking water elsewhere and also isn't being combined. Because we do think that there are solutions. They just have to be aired.
ForcedistanceTimes.com. Emily de la Bruyere. We'll have a link to your website in our description below. Always a pleasure and fascinating speaking with you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.